Well, welcome to Arundel House this afternoon. I'm Ben Barry and I'm the land warfare expert here at the Institute, and we've got with us Brigadier Steve McMahon, who commands the 104th Logistics Support Brigade of the British Army. I think we've all heard quite a bit and read quite a bit about the Ebola outbreak in West Africa last year, so I won't make any other points about it. And I think what's been well covered was that UK deployed an interagency task force, not just of the military, but also of experts from the National Health Service. And the whole thing was held together, the military effort, by the headquarters of 104 Logistics Support Brigade, commanded by Brigadier Steve McMahon here. And I've invited him to come and talk about what was a pretty unique operation and a pretty unique joint interagency and multinational effort to tackle the terrible disease. Steve's going to speak for about 30 minutes on the record. He's got some PowerPoints to support him, so if you'll do get where you can see them. And then there'll be an opportunity for questions, answers and discussion from the floor. Steve, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for turning up here today. It's been a month now, just over a month, since I returned from Sierra Leone. It's a fascinating story, a fascinating journey that we're on and is still going on. I'm always delighted to talk about it at length. I think if I were allowed, I would talk for hours and hours and hours. I had, before this operation, previous experience in Sierra Leone back in the Civil War, so I had a head start, I think. But I could talk on anthropology, and certainly now on epidemiology. Who would have thought it, for hours and hours, but I won't. What I'll be doing is sticking during this presentation into a format shown there. I'm going to give a bit of the context, and I think the context is really important in terms of this operation. Talk about some of the issues about integrated operations working as an interagency task force. I'll cover in very, very general terms strategy and the military concept of operations that sort of underpinned the wider strategy and how we delivered the tactical effect. Then a bit about some of the outcomes, mindful that we are very, very much still in that contingent operation of dealing with Ebola in Sierra Leone, and the risk is still there. And some of the observations. And then, as Ben said, I will stop for questions. I'm happy to answer any questions you have. First and foremost, I think it's important, and excuse me, I'm going to script this because I've got to stay within time, otherwise I'll veer off and start waffling. It's important to recognise that the situation we faced in Sierra Leone was unique and may not, if we're lucky, be repeated. Now, I make this point because we need to be careful not to reach false conclusions when drawing together lessons from our work in Sierra Leone. While there are some general lessons to be learnt, particularly in interagency coherency, many of the tactical observations are specific to the exceptional conditions at the time and space. I think, personally, that there were 4 key factors that made this operation unique. First was the size and scale and complexity of the Ebola epidemic across the Mano River Basin. Previous epidemics had peaked at several hundred and had been contained within months, if not weeks. In Sierra Leone alone, at the worst point, we were seeing over 200 new cases per day. And as part of that context, in September 2014, the World Health Organization gave a warning and a prediction that if the pathogen could not be controlled, what we'd be seeing is 20,000 cases a week, a regional spread, and perhaps a global pandemic that would have infected millions. Hence the background and reason for our deployment. We came to view Ebola as a perfect insurgent. It preyed upon the weak, vulnerable, and uneducated. Human kindness was certainly the superhighway for the spread and the exponential spread, in fact, of the disease. Many of the societal and cultural practices which have and still are proving to be extremely difficult to change exacerbated the spread of Ebola. None more so than the treatment of the sick and the customs involved in preparing and handling the dead. No matter what tribe, region, religion, or secret societal sect people have allegiance to, or no matter about their education levels or how much they knew about Ebola, they all believed and still believe that if they didn't treat the dead with respect, including the intimate washing of bodies, both they and the dead would be damned to eternal hell. Now that seems strange to say, but I guarantee for everyone from the president down thinks in that way. It's in the DNA, it's in the culture. And that proved extremely difficult to break. In my opinion, Sierra Leone was almost in a state of total war. Nothing was untouched by Ebola. It directly affected politics, economics, security, agriculture, food supply, and the everyday lives of the whole population. The second factor was the failure of the institutions of the government of Sierra Leone to act in a timely and coordinated manner. Some of this was due to a reluctance of the leadership to recognise and accept the magnitude of the situation, but mostly it was due, in my opinion, to the signal failure of the government of Sierra Leone Ministry of Health to act in an effective way. Third was the speed of the response from the international community. At this point, I must say that I have huge respect for those non-government organisations, humanitarians and charities that deployed, that continue to do that work. They're all very altruistic and very, very, very brave. And we all owe them in this country a huge debt of thanks for what they've done and continue to do. But my point is that these organisations were working in a bespoke manner. No level 3 humanitarian emergency had been officially declared, and therefore no UN OCHA cluster lead had been established. The result was an uncoordinated series of independent responses, which itself gave space and time for the infection to spread in all 3 countries. Finally, the fourth factor, which made this operation unique for us, the British military, was the historical relationship between Sierra Leone and the British. You will all know that we have a special relationship with the country, and in many ways are bound to assist and protect as required. Significantly, though, a large proportion of the population have great respect for British military personnel, who they see as the saviours during the last civil war. In many ways, and strangely, someone in British combat uniform draws more respect, has more access and influence than NGOs, aid workers and government officials. Now, I know of no other country where that would be true, and it made a huge difference. Moving on to the British response to the emergency. You will no doubt recall the background, the political deliberations and the international pressure which developed over the spring and summer of 2014. When it was clear that a suitable response from the international community was not emergent, the UK government decided to mount an interagency task force under a Department for International Development lead into Sierra Leone to reinforce the DFID, Foreign Office and MOD presence that was already there. My brigade, in its new role as the Vanguard Enabling Group, with a mix of joint defence capabilities, including specialist engineers, medics, communicators, logisticians, marines, sailors, engineers, helicopter crews, airmen and intelligence specialists, was tasked to support DFID, and we deployed in under 48 hours to Sierra Leone. In those early days, I was often asked in the early media interviews if what we were doing was too little too late. My response at the time, and always has been, that surely it was never too late to try and save lives. The urgency, pervasive threat, lack of tactical understanding, or an agreed strategy all work together to forge interoperability, coherence and unity between the UK interagency organisations. We had no time for petty politics or the friction which may have arose from the cultural and structural differences between us. Instead, mutual respect and a heavy application of emotional intelligence and patience from all involved enabled the creation of an effective and efficient interagency force. Of course, it wasn't all sweetness and light. There were many frictions and challenges, particularly in gaining coherency in strategic, operational and tactical command and control, decision making and direction. The structural differences in layers of command, the lamination of layers itself between the MOD and DFID, created natural offsets of incoherence. The antidote was creating unity of command, unity of purpose, and above all, because we couldn't afford crossfires or ineffectiveness, unity of effort. In practice, we created what I clumsily called the tactical trinity, which was led by the head of DFID, Donald Brown, for those of you who know him, and supported by Peter West, the High Commissioner, and myself. We were given clear direction at the strategic and political level, either through the twice-weekly Cobras or through the cross-Whitehall huddle, which happened on a daily basis, or directly through our own chains of command. Now, given the context I described earlier, it was immediately apparent when we got there that there was much space, time, opportunity, and actually requirement for the application of military force to deliver operational and tactical humanitarian effect. And in that, I include the provision of command and control, which you wouldn't normally assume is a humanitarian effect, but it was in terms of its coherency in this operation. It became an effect in itself, and I will turn to it shortly, but primarily in the delivery of specialist military engineering and medical outputs to fill what we discovered was a lack of DFID final mile capability. So on to strategy. I apologise for the fact that I might not be able to read that, but it's a picture. It shows the Joint Interagency Task Force strategy for Phase 1. It displays the ends, ways and means of delivering the intermediate aim of reducing the infective reproductive rate, the R0 figure, or the R rate, to a figure below 1. As a reminder, when we arrived, the R rate was somewhere between 1.8 and 2, and that's average across the country. There were areas where it was gusting 2.5 and above, certainly within the Western area, certainly within Freetown, and certainly within the district of Port Loco. And we knew that it was going to get much, much worse before it got better. You will note that the ways and means here focused on key areas such as delivering safe burials, safe medical practices, safe isolation, and more effective means of the end-to-end management of live cases. Sitting under this strategy was our military concept of operations, which we derived following an extensive estimate which included a number of experts, anthropologists, epidemiologists, aid workers, government officials, and if I'm absolutely candid, anyone we could find who had a clue about what was going on in Sierra Leone at that time. The framework of the approach we adopted hung on the delivery of 7 lines of operations over 3 phases. I'll take the phases first. Phase 1 was really about dealing with the emergency and providing an immediate, effective and very apparent response. We focused on quick wins such as creating a means of managing and dealing with the ever-increasing amount of infected dead bodies being dumped in Freetown and the Western area. The way in which the virus works means that, unlike viruses such as the flu, Ebola victims become more infective as they become more ill. Even after death, the viral load increases, meaning that dead bodies become super incubators for up to 4 or 5 days in the tropical climate. Alongside the Republic of Sierra Leone Armed Forces, international agencies and the government, we rapidly established a command and control and coordination centre within Freetown, focused on dead body management first, but also ambulances, and the management of the live cases. The bottom line in all that is that together, as a joint force, what we did was we gave hope. And that hope itself became effective in the vacuum. We recognised Freetown as our operational centre of gravity. The government, the rule of law and the stability rather than physical structures themselves, with Lungi Airport as a critical requirement to that. If we'd lost Freetown, I would have soon been commanding the evacuation of all entitled personnel from Sierra Leone, and we would not have been able to contain a regional and possibly global pandemic. Phase 2 focused on exploiting success and expanding our efforts, and there were 5 key delivery pillars within Phase 2. The first was the deployment of combined military teams, DFID and stabilisation unit personnel, out into the districts themselves to establish and run what we call district Ebola response centres, enabling control measures to be imposed and coordinated down to village level, through paramount chiefs, through all the chiefdoms and down to village level. The second piece was the delivery of the 6 UK-funded and built Ebola treatment units in Kerrytown, Hastings, Goderich, Port Loko, Makeni and Moyamba, alongside the delivery of additional treatment units and community isolation and care establishments. Third was the delivery of trained staff who could operate in safe and controlled manner, thereby reducing infection amongst medical personnel and transmission in treatment units. You'll note from our strategy that was one of the, apart from the management of dead bodies, that was another one of the key means of transmission. Fourth was the Western Area surge. The surge started in late November, and it followed a frightening warning and a very sober warning to us from the US Centre of Disease Control and the World Health Organization. One evening they insisted on talking to myself and Donald Brown, sat us down in our operations centre and said, look, no matter what you do to increase the effectiveness, the efficiency and the number of bed spaces and isolation facilities you've got in Freetown, you are going to lose Freetown. They showed us some very, very smart graphs which showed the exponential curve still rising and the step of our effectiveness and the gulf between them. We stayed steady. It was frightening. We launched the Western Area surge. I think the problem was that they hadn't counted for what we'd already done in their maths. And actually, by increasing social mobilisation, increasing influence, the influence campaign, by delivering that which was already going to come in online and just giving it a bit more of a poke than we had done and bringing a few more partners on board, we were able to contain that threat. So that never happened, thank goodness. And finally, an intensive shaping and influence campaign, which was personally led by the President of Sierra Leone with our support. The influence campaign focused on changing behaviours at the individual level. And if you like, I can get into that in questions. Phase 3, which continues today, was about gaining control. It marked the point at which we changed from being reactive to proactive, effectively hunting the disease down through a matrix of surveillance, contacts tracing and isolation procedures. It was also the point at which we bent the curve. Results would have been faster. I've got to say, results would have been faster if we had received the experts in terms of surveillance that we've been asking for and we've been promised by organisations such as the World Health Organization. But as it was, the technical delivery was delivered and in some means is still being delivered, but what I termed as brilliant amateurs. Military folk, DFID folk, stabilisation unit folk. As I've mentioned, we adopted 7 lines of operation, the first of which was command and control. Earlier I described how this became an effect in itself. We broke the delivery of the command and control down into 3 main areas. First, the provision of a command platform for the Joint Interagency Task Force, essentially the military providing the physical, structural, conceptual architecture and tools on which DFID operations could be run. Second, transformation of a failing Ministry of Health run Ebola Operations Centre, or EOC it was called at the time, into a new National Ebola Response Centre, or the NERC, run by central government, led by the previous Ministry of Defence, Paulo Conte, and manned and supported at every level by a combination of Republic of Sierra Leone Armed Forces and members of the British force. Additionally, UNMIR, once they got their act together, eventually became a crucial member and contributor to the NERC. Third was the establishment of the command and coordination centres at district levels, District Ebola Response Centres, or DIRCs, which proved absolutely fundamental in launching a successful containment operation across the country. The construction line of operation focused initially on the construction of the 6 UK-funded hospitals by a joint team of British military engineer specialists, DFID contract support staff, international contractors, and locally employed civilians. Our real challenge lay in determining the right balance of specifications for these hospitals. Not too complicated, so they would take too long to build, but with enough technical specification to attract the partners who would operate the facilities. I've got to say, at the time we were building these, there weren't partners. Apart from Save the Children, DFID was still hunting for partners to operate these hospitals. So at the same time as building them, we were getting into negotiation about what people wanted. A compromise was achieved, and despite the need to make amendments to each unit to suit the eventual operator and the worst of the rainy season, all 6 hospitals were delivered from jungle to world-class facility in under 10 weeks. A Herculean effort by all those involved. Additionally, our specialist engineers also advised and assisted with the delivery of a further 300 bed spaces across the country, as well as providing support to a number of charities and NGOs. The third line of operation was what we called treat. This was broken down into 2 key areas, Ebola care and non-Ebola care, or the provision of Role 2 medical support to the interagency force and, for a long period, the whole international community in Sierra Leone. Now, our efforts in running the Ebola treatment unit at Carytown are now well known. We opened the facility on the 5th of November and have since treated over 97 people from 15 nations, of which we've had 39 positive cases to date. Mostly we provided expert medical care for a wide range of Sierra Leone nationals, 58 in total. Notably, we found that if we could get patients in early enough, survival rates could be up to in the order of 70%. Now, unfortunately, that was very rare because people were reticent to report early. So what we were getting was people in stage 2 and stage 3 of the illness. And in such cases, despite the expert care that we could give in that treatment facility, survival rates were about 48 to 50%, which is about average. As many will know, we shared the site with Save the Children, who operated an 80-bed facility, and we developed a close relationship with them, even providing specialist military and consultant leadership to run their hospital for a short period. Of course, the main reason for running a world-class military treatment facility was to assure both national and international healthcare workers that they would get the best treatment available in Sierra Leone as part of a wider framework which included the transportation to the UK and other countries for treatment, thereby helping with the inflow of the healthcare and charity workers, which were absolutely crucial to the success of this operation. In terms of wider medical support, we provided a Role 2 care hospital at our main operating base in Freetown and an enhanced facility afloat on RFA Argus, as well as essential rotary wing support to provide extended clinical support and casualty evacuation. The latter enabled me as the commander to take greater risk and deploy our personnel widely across Sierra Leone. Notably, this was something that the American forces in Liberia, and I was talking to them again last week, couldn't do in terms of deploying their people to operate in the districts. Training might seem a misplaced line of operation for the military in this context. However, we quickly identified a shortfall in safely trained staff for isolation and treatment units. And we therefore deployed another regiment who by reinforcing an in-place World Health Organization-led and MSF-accredited training facility at the National Football Stadium, established what we called the Ebola Training Academy. The academy spread over 3 sites and was manned by a mixture of British military, Republic of Sierra Leone armed forces, and national and international aid workers. It had a target of training over 3,200 personnel in 5 weeks, and they actually achieved 4,000 trained personnel in just over 4 weeks, and handed over to an NGO who continued to provide excellent training in country. It's worth noting that as well as providing trained staff, we also assisted the social mobilisation programme and the influence campaign by providing an additional 4,000 people who themselves became a means of spreading information in communities on how to avoid catching and spreading Ebola. In my view, by far the most important line of operation was our efforts to influence behaviours, and I spoke about that at the start. Widely termed as social mobilisation, and earlier I described how Ebola was the perfect insurgent, And therefore, it should come as no surprise to hear that much of our strategy mirrored our principles of counterinsurgent operations. Principles such as unity of effort, securing the population, maintaining popular support, understanding the human terrain, which was crucial, neutralising the insurgent, and crucially again, maintaining the ability to learn and adapt. And I think our decision action cycle was well below 6 hours at one point in terms of learning, observing, acting. In practice, we supported the President, as I said, His Excellency Dr. Ernest Bai Koroma, who led the campaign from the very front. His efforts were tireless, and I've got to say, he was extremely, extremely impressive. Had to have limited queuing, really got it. Would get out there and influence directly the paramount chiefs, the village elders, and spread that message. And it made a huge, huge difference. And it was the point at which we were able to turn the tide and bend the curve. We were able just to influence those paramount chiefs more than anything else. In terms of protection, our efforts were broadly delivered along 3 lines. First, the force protection, force health protection of my personnel and the wider interagency force. That was my main effort throughout. And despite the dangers of Ebola, which still exist, by far the main risk came from malaria and road traffic accidents. And I had to ensure that I had mitigated for each. Secondly, in terms of protection, was the wider security and freedom of movement provided by a combination of our integral force protection team, the Republic of Sierra Leone Armed Forces, and the Sierra Leone Police. Their main effort was to ensure that vital engineering and or medical supplies were not disrupted. Finally, on protection was the need to plan and prepare to execute an evacuation operation so that should the situation have become out of control. I won't go into detail of that, but I can say that in 29 years of military service, that was the most difficult operation that I had planned, mainly due to the risks of Ebola and the needs of having a safe place of isolation as well as being able to take people out of the country. The last line of operation was focused on the sustainment of the interagency task force and the maintenance of our operational capability. It included the vital provision of medical supplies and equipment to our own treatment units, the 6 UK-funded facilities run by independent operators, and the crucial laboratories operated so well by Public Health England. But I also include the final mile delivery to construction sites and isolation centres, as well as assistance provided by military personnel and our own rotary wing assets to agencies such as the World Health Organization. So how do we do? I think that at this point it's fair to say that certainly interagency operations and our approach to working as an interagency task force was a success in many areas. Interagency operations are not new, but we have certainly opened a new chapter in cross-government integrated approach for humanitarian as well as other types of operation. While the EVD rates, the Ebola rates, came down with an infectivity rate below 0.5 by the time my headquarters left, and the regional and global spread definitely contained, it must be noted that Ebola has neither been defeated nor eradicated. The risks are still there. The epidemiology curve has crested and is falling at a rapid rate, but we must expect what some of us have been calling a bumpy tail on the way to zero. Sierra Leone is about 4 months behind Liberia in that context, I think. But complacency, especially in the high population density of the western area, and last week we've seen last 2 weeks we've seen a spike of 48 cases coming out of the western area, is the absolute enemy. The epidemic started with a single case, and nobody is safe until the last case has been hunted down and isolated. Furthermore, a wider health emergency has been unmasked in Sierra Leone, and this will make things even more difficult. It exacerbates the situation. I'll give you a quick example. When I left, we were still burying in Freetown, the western area, about 40 people a day. The day I left, of those 40 people, 1 person was a positive Ebola case. 50% of those people we were burying were under 10 years old. There's a significant health emergency that's happened through the collapse of the Ministry of Health and the exacerbation of everything else there is in Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone is a beautiful country, for those of you who don't know it, but it will kill you. not a natural place to survive. Nevertheless, in my opinion, UK cross-government operations, combined with extraordinarily brave efforts from a number of NGOs, charity organisations, the NHS and the government of Sierra Leone, have been a success to date. For our part, I put that success down to two key approaches. First, our doggedness to get out into the districts and fight the battle at chiefdom level. And secondly, our assistance with launching an intensive shaping and influence campaign aimed at the social mobilisation, influence and behavioural changes within the wider population. I think we've learnt much, not only about fighting one of the world's most dangerous pathogens, but some wide-ranging observations on our return to a contingent footing after years of campaigning. I'd like to end by highlighting two observations which stand out most to me as the military commander. First was the performance of the Republic of Sierra Leone Armed Forces, who were without doubt the absolute heroes in the fight against Ebola in Sierra Leone. They were involved at every level. They operated a bespoke ambulance service when there was none. They ran burial teams and burial command posts. They provided officers and senior NCOs to man the national and district Ebola response centres. They provided engineer support for the build of the UK-funded treatment units. They assisted in running Ebola training academy. And they operated 3 Ebola treatment units, saving the lives of hundreds. The performance of the young officers and senior NCOs was notably of a very high standard. Now, the stoical nature and robustness of the wonderful people of Sierra Leone has a large part to play in that. But so does, in my view, over 13 years of direct engagement by the British military, particularly the running of academies and training establishments. For me, undoubted proof that upstream defence engagement works. The Republic of Sierra Leone Armed Forces were the only government organisation to stand the test of this crisis. Perhaps then we should use our engagement there as the exemplar for engagement in other countries. Secondly, although we British like nothing better to beat ourselves up for not doing enough, or perhaps not doing it in the right way, I believe that we should all be very proud of the efforts and parts played by the British people in Sierra Leone. In the military, our core strength definitely continues to be the flexibility, resourcefulness and quality of our personnel, especially our more junior ranks. But I think this is also true of the people involved in the wider UK response. Charity workers, NGOs, NHS staff, civil servants, contractors and a whole host of others. It may be some time before we see the true magnitude of what has been done to save Sierra Leone. And I hope that we won't ever see it, because the real threat of the global pandemic I spoke about earlier has definitely been contained. But I'm in no doubt that we should all be very proud of those British people who have played such a vital role and continue to do so today in Sierra Leone. I'll end it there, and I'll be happy to take any questions you have.
Well, Steve, that's been absolutely fascinating. Can I just ask you, though, about what you saw of the operations in Liberia, the US-led ones? You mentioned one key difference in the way that gave you greater confidence. Were there other differences dictated by the circumstances or a different US approach?
I think I had a lot of liaison and negotiation with the Americans in Liberia, but mainly on the military side. So when General Williams was there initially, I spoke to him. He commanded a rapid deployable sort of theatre entry organisation, quite similar to mine. They were replaced by the 101st Brigade, commanded by General Joe Valesky. Joe Valesky and I had a conversation on a weekly basis. Their approach was to provide, as we did, support to US aid, but it was done in a very frictional manner. They had differences. They were under a lot more constraints than we were. My decision to deploy people out in the district was something they could not do. They were not allowed to do that. And that frustrated the hell out of them on a daily basis. But they were well ahead of us by the time we got there. I must admit, they were well ahead of us in terms of construction. They were well ahead of us in terms of the situation in Liberia. Comparing Liberia, although Ebola is Ebola, comparing Liberia, for those of you who know the region, with Sierra Leone is a bit like comparing an apple with a pear. They are very, very different. Very different. Certainly in terms of a social and anthropological context, but also in terms of what the country looks like, how easily the disease is spread, what the population centres look like, and the outlook of the people. Point one, and I've written a lot on this and drawn a point one, and I won't waffle too much on this, but religion. It's almost a mirror of the religious context in Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone, 70% of people are Muslim. In Liberia, 70% of people are Christian. A lot of most of the cultural practices to do with burials were pure core with an E cultural practices. It didn't matter what religion you were from in the main, but what we found that those of the Islamic faith were washing more bodies than those of the Christian faith. So straight away that was one. There are probably, I can name 8 key pillars of differences between the two countries, which made a difference. But in chasing the epidemic terms, we were 4 months behind them, 4 to 6 months behind them. But yes, I did have there were a number of differences, and I spoke to them on a weekly basis.
Well, thank you, Steve. Well, there's now a chance for you to ask any questions or make any points from the floor. The rules of engagement are: you catch my eye, I'll call you. If you could say who you are and what organisation you belong to, and keep your questions or points as short as possible, so we give the maximum number of opportunities. Nick Childs from the BBC.
Nick.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Brigadier. And I reiterate what Ben said, a very illuminating talk on how things unfolded. I'd just like to ask you to elaborate a bit more on one element that you discussed in passing, which was the challenges of the evacuation plan, as it were. Yeah. Presumably, in terms of Whitehall's priorities, it must have been a hugely important priority to have that, but also for the confidence of your own people and everyone else. And yet at the same time, I wonder whether there were any frictions you had to deal with in terms of perceptions on the grounds from locals, that if you were spending too much time looking at that there would be a suspicion that actually you would just bail out if things got too bad. So whether you have any thing more you could say on that.
That's a fair question, and I can see that, I can see why you ask it. The first one is it was a specific task given to me to plan it if it were required. But I was left in no doubt by Whitehall and my own chain of command that was something that we were not to be doing. What we were to do was to be successful with the fight against Ebola. And quite rightly so. But it was something that I had to plan. Planning for it was done within the interagency task force alone. We didn't involve too many people in that. So we did it, as you would expect, with some emotional intelligence, in a very balanced nature. The point of us being there was to assist the government. And the point of us being there was to help them contain the spread of Ebola and eventually eradicate Ebola. So it was a task, but it wasn't a priority. And I think that, that's first and foremost. The issue, the difficulties about evacuation operations from countries where they're called or necessary is what you would normally do is evacuate as many people you can into a safe place. The difficulties, of course, is Ebola was rife throughout the country, so you had to have a means of screening people. You had to have a number of layers of where you could go through screening and treatment, follow people off. And also, of course, we were running hospitals. So what you couldn't be doing was evacuating people who were either suspect cases or confirmed cases who were in stage 2 or 3 of the disease because they couldn't be moved. So actually, rather than an evacuation operation, what it was more about was providing hubs of safety. should we have to, for people within Sierra Leone. And of course, within that, we do include the mechanism of government and supporting the mechanism of government in maintaining stability throughout the country.
Thanks. Anyone else? Alex Nichol from the ISS.
Hi.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed for your talk, very interesting. You made one or two references to final mile delivery, and I just wondered if, I didn't quite understand the phrase, and I just wondered if you could elaborate a bit on what you were saying about that.
Again, it's my personal opinion, and my DFID colleagues, who I'm great friends with now, and I know much more about DFID than I ever thought I would. But I think over the years, it wouldn't be unfair to say that the Department for International Development have become more of a supporter of partner organisations, more reliant on others to do the sort of what we call the final mile, the last point of delivery, whether that be in humanitarian aid, whether that be in logistics, whether that be in medical support. And that's the way it's developed. So it's a funder of that activity. The issue in Sierra Leone was you didn't have them, or where you did have those partners, they were already busy. Because of the difference between in the responses by the international community to different countries, the way it worked, Liberia got the most of the international aid community straight away. In areas such as Kailahun and Kenema, MSF had established, IFRC had established their support there, but there weren't many in the country. So what we found, that there was a lack of international aid agencies to do what they'd normally done for DFID. They were all busy elsewhere, or they weren't coming. Because, and mainly they weren't coming because of the risk in terms of the health security situation for them. Many of those people that would want to come, and I spoke to many over the phone and by other means, who said they would love to come, but they were not being allowed by their own organisations because of the risk, the level of risk. So actually what we had to do was fill this gap and at the same time make the conditions stable enough and secure enough to entice, by building hospitals, by getting to entice these partners in to fill that gap. Because the answer wasn't military. The answer is aid agencies, charities, NGOs to do that. But DFID are looking at how they might approach this situation should that happen again.
Thanks.
Austin
Pierce from the Army.
Austin Pierce, Army Headquarters. Brigadier, could you explain any other nations' specialist or enabling capabilities that were brought to the operation, particularly from their militaries perhaps, and how that was orchestrated?
Definitely. I think the main two were, and we became, in end of November, a combined joint interagency task force. The Canadians came aboard. Fantastic medical support that they provided. They ended up, I think it was providing 40% of the capability to run the Ebola treatment unit in Kerrytown amongst NHS workers and British military medics. They're on their second roulement at the moment, and they're even talking about doing a third roulement. And we had some Canadians in our headquarters in Freetown as well. The Irish came on board as well and provided people that operated in the district Ebola response centres, operated out of our main headquarters in terms of Ebola and non-Ebola medical support as well. So they're often not so much military, but there are a whole host of others. I mean, in terms of combined, of course, the Sierra Leone Armed Forces, who I explained did so much for us. But there were other others in the international community, not military, that also followed in. The Australians who have a for-profit medical company called Aspen, who ran the treatment unit at Hastings, folded a team into my headquarters as well. In my headquarters, I made the point from day one that everyone was welcome. This was a true interagency task force. What I wanted was people that could help me solve Ebola. It wasn't an exclusive club. It was definitely an inclusive club. So we had lots of people involved in this.
Thank you. Gentleman by the corner. Oh, it's Mark from the Sunday Times.
From the
Hey, Mark.
Times. Hi. And you mentioned a couple of times that obviously you were warned by the American experts that you were going to lose Freetown. Well, what do you mean by lose Freetown? What's the threshold effectively to where you say you're at that point?
The warning, and it was a very sobering moment because we were sure that we weren't going to. We were sure we had this. But my only means of getting a true recognised picture of what was happening with the epidemiology was, and we had a really, really close relationship with the Centre for Disease Control and the World Health Organisation. They came to my headquarters on a nightly basis, gave us an update, gave us briefing. But they were sure, because of the population density in Freetown mostly, and those, a third of the 6 million population live in the shanties in and around Freetown, that Ebola was taking hold in the shanties, and it was going to be very, very difficult to control. And therefore, no matter how many bed spaces we were creating, we weren't just looking at the 3 UK-funded 100-bed hospitals in and around the Western area. We were looking at supporting people like King's Partnership in Sierra Leone, all sorts of different agencies. I had my engineers out, putting new roofs on, isolation centres, all sorts of things we were trying to do. And DFID were remarkable in their efforts to try and fund and support and stand people up. And what we were after was creating a number of isolation centres. CDC was saying it doesn't matter what you do, the exponential rate of the spread of Ebola in Freetown will beat you. Because you haven't got there quick enough. Now, my point, Mark, was that I don't think, this is about a month after we'd started phase 1, and recognising that it was, Freetown was such a centre of gravity, they hadn't included the impact of that in their maths. And the way it works, there's a lag, thankfully. And actually, when you calculated the effect of that lag into the curve, what you'd already had is bending the curve towards what we had at capacity. Now, there were at least 3 nights where I retired very early in the morning, looking at the numbers of how many people we still had in the community that we couldn't drag out and get into an isolation centre, safely into an isolation centre. Certainly, for those 3 nights, we'd hit capacity across the 1,000 or so bed spaces that were around Western Area and Freetown. But they were very minimal numbers, thankfully, and what we could do through isolation, through surveillance, through contact tracing in those areas where we had to leave people in the community, by tracing the people in touch, we could isolate that plume, the threat of the plume. And just by sticking with it and creating more beds on a daily basis and getting better at our ambulance services, getting better at our case management, we were able to pip it. You could almost feel the curve creaking over to where we wanted it to be, but we just by holding tight and just doing those simple things, and a remarkable effort by the Sierra Leoneans themselves, beat the Ebola curve in Freetown. It was almost an impossible task, but they did it.
Other questions, lady in there.
Thank you, Catherine Wilson from the Africa Programme at Chatham House.
Hi.
You mentioned the key role of President Corona. But what was your sense of the wider institutional and governmental awareness of the scale of the healthcare problem, especially because President Corona will be leading Sierra Leone forever?
Which is a shame, because President Corona is, and I worked really, really closely with President Corona for a long time, is an exceptional leader and does exceptionally well given some inherent weaknesses in the structure of government and the ministries within Sierra Leone, which isn't all their fault. You've got to remember where Sierra Leone is and was. Sierra Leone came through 2 really, really difficult civil wars. It held its first free and fair election, which brought Ernest Bai Koroma in. It had one of the fastest increasing rates of GDP in the region before the Ebola epidemic broke, and it was getting there. But there is endemic corruption in Sierra Leone that is almost within the DNA of the country. I go back to the days of Shaka Stevens. Shaka Stevens, who created a sort of new era of government before the civil wars, used to have a term that said that a tethered cow must be able to feast on the grass that it has in its field. And he was referring to his ministers must be able to have what they want from their own areas. And that attitude still prevails today. It's really difficult to break that. And there's this sort of short-term culture in Sierra Leone. Now, I love Sierra Leone. I hope you get that from there. I spent a long time there, and I just love the country and the people. They're wonderful. But those wonderful people have a very short-sighted view on the world, and you can expect that. The life expectancy has risen. It's now 42. So you can understand a bit, and there are so many diseases. You name it, it's there. And I do mean it's unnatural almost for them to live there. What does that mean? I always use the analogy that if you ask most people in Sierra Leone, and said, here, I've got $50, which I'm going to give you today as a gift. Or I won't give you that, and I'll come back next week, and I'll give you $500 as a gift. Pretty much all the Sierra Leoneans that I know would take that $50. The difference between Sierra Leone is they would come back to me a week later and ask me where that $500 was that I owed them. And they do it in such a lovely, characterful way. And I say that because actually the people in government aren't bad people. They're just ineffective. There's corruption within it that's going to take years and years and years to stamp out. So it doesn't naturally work as well as we might think a structure of government would. So I think he's done particularly well to overcome those difficulties. Clearly he's got good advisors around him. Clearly he's got several people within the government. Paolo Conte, who was the Minister of Defence, who was brought across to run the National Ebola Response Centre, taken off the Minister of Health, did a remarkable job considering he was the Minister of Defence. A great bloke, really up for the battle, and really good people around him. And although I've slated the Ministry of Health somewhat, the CMO, great. He came on board, really got to it. There were a number of people there, but as a collective government, not as effective as we want. Sorry, I did waffle there.
Right, got time for a couple more questions? Yeah, lady in the middle.
Jill Russell, King's College War Studies. It seems that the greatest Western military capability is logistics, but it's not usually the thing that people talk about. But it seems like in these situations, humanitarian assistance in either health or disaster situations, that this is what we can bring. And if these are the perfect insurgents, these conditions are the perfect pre-insurgencies or pre-crises.
Yeah.
Going forward, and you're in the middle of a strategic defense review, going forward, what do you argue for in terms of this sort of a capability and its place in defense strategy and policy for the UK and maybe the West? I mean, it seems to me the way to go forward. This is the capability that we have that far exceeds anything else that anybody else can bring to the table. And it's a way to do something that sells a strategic communications message that's very good for the West. So going forward with the lessons learned from this, from what you've seen you can accomplish and do, where do you push it in policy and strategy?
That's a really, really good question. I could talk for hours on that one. If I just answer it with a couple of points. The first one is just a reminder of the context of this one, which was very different. I think, and it's the wrong term, but there was a permissiveness for the use of military forces here that I don't think you would see elsewhere. There were, MSF were openly asking us for support. I haven't seen that in any other operation, and humanitarian operations. Because that's not the normal status quo, is it? You don't really want military people involved with with aid agencies for all the right reasons in my book. However, there was lots of opportunity in this operation to show how there is a utility of military force, not just logistics, but in terms of what we've always known about, communications, rotary wing assets, strategic air and those kind of things, that there is a use for that, that in humanitarian aid environments. But I think one of the things we need to go forward with in an SDSR context is to develop this thing that some of us now are calling integrated action. And that we need to look not only because there are probably capabilities, and I'm not just talking about within the Ministry of Defence, there are cross-government capabilities that we may be able to use in a more effective and efficient, in a tight fiscal climate, manner. And I think that's probably what we need to do a really good analysis of, and look to see where we can make those issues, and really examine where best we can use those. So things like logistics, things like communications, things like specialist engineering capability. There are bits out there we could probably make more use of, and they are world-class capabilities that we have.
One more question. No? Well, that's been a most informative presentation. I wonder if I could just make some concluding points. The first point is that within the Institute we have a security and development programme who aren't here today because they're on fieldwork in Latin America, but the sort of security and development challenges of health is firmly on their radar. The next point is that Jill's point, I mean, if you want armed forces to be able to do things at distance from home, you do need an expeditionary logistics capability with all the different disciplines in that, including medical and maintenance, as well as the receipt and forward movement of all the stuff that armed forces need. And certainly in the ISS, over the last couple of years, we've tried to reflect this better in the Military Balance, our flagship publication. And you'll see much, as far as possible, we've tried to capture expeditionary logistic forces where they actually exist. And I think if you look at the British military, it has been quite interesting to see logistic outfits used in this way. In the 1990s, there were twice British task forces that deployed to Angola and then Rwanda, where the command and control was a logistic battalion. In a sense, to a certain extent, they're a non-governmental organisation run by the military, but the logistic headquarters was what enabled that. And we may well have forgotten also that it was the British Logistic Brigade in Kosovo that rapidly built the 6 tented camps for the huge flow of refugees. This logistic brigade was in Macedonia, but rapidly erected the 6 tented camps for the huge flow of refugees coming from Kosovo. And then, of course, it was a logistic brigade headquarters that went into the British Department of the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs to help them plan and then execute the operation against foot and mouth. I think it's also interesting that there were 3 unexpected security challenges strategically last year. The rise of the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, Russia and the Ukraine, but Ebola. And out of all the achievements that of this particular task force, Steve has neglected to say that after the British drew down in Afghanistan, he was commanding the largest British overseas operation in the world. But I think, my sense is also that this is potentially an increasing challenge of the future. There are a number of trends coming out of globalisation, including the rapid spreading of genetic engineering know-how, but also the global mega trend of urbanisation that actually make unhelpful pandemics more rather than less likely. So, Steve, thank you very much for a really insightful and really relevant talk. And can we wish you and all the men and women of your brigade best good fortune in the future? And will you join me in thanking him?